but they're not racist. Are you kidding me? All right, let's go. He's on, okay. Welcome to The Right Perspective.
Hi, Nick.
John, Frank, it's a pleasure to talk to you. I've been listening to you since Wednesdays. I hope you're feeling better, Frank.
Thank you.
I want to thank you for your service, both on the domestic front and overseas for our country.
Well, thank you. Thanks for calling and participating.
Well, you know, for many years, Democrats have been slandering conservatives. This is not a new thing with the Tea Parties. It wasn't until I got a lot older, you know, I'm a young man, that I learned the truth about McCarthy and that they were actually communists. I had to learn this from an Ann Coulter book, which is a recent publication. I didn't learn this in school. I had to learn about the Tet Offensive in Vietnam and Hollywood and the media, specifically Walter Cronkite and their willingness to be propagandists for the communists. So I basically, these days, I don't trust anything that the left labels conservatives as. So I went back, and one of the major things that the Democrats and the leftists always bring up is Richard Nixon's Southern strategy. You know, of course, they like to ignore the anti-white racism within their own party that they just apparently ignore. They also ignore Robert KKK Byrd and the Dixiecrats and the massive amount of racism that came out from the left, true, real racism. And Harry Reid can say real racist things that normal people don't say, and they just gloss over it. But in a book titled Richard M. Nixon, Politician, President, and Administrator, a piece by Glenn Moore, I'm going to email it to John and yourself for the entire piece, because I know you guys are stressed for time. And in it, he talks about the Southern strategy, and he mentions specifically that Wallace they had to concede the South to Wallace anyway, because Wallace had the Deep South racist vote. And in Atlanta, Nixon directly attacked Wallace, saying he was not fit to be president because of his statement that he would have his driver run over any protesters who blocked his way. He also picked Agnew, which, if he were to be true to the Southern racists that he supposedly met when he met with a meeting with Strom Thurmond, why would he pick Agnew? Agnew had a strong black support when he ran for governor in 1966. He ran against George P. Mahoney, and you'll love this, Frank. Mahoney, a Democrat who strongly opposed open housing in 1963 when Agnew was elected executive of Baltimore County. He passed the first local public accommodations law in the South. As governor, he passed an open housing bill, hired many blacks, passed fair hiring bills, and helped enact other progressive, quote-unquote, legislation, including a tough anti-pollution bill. Why, I don't know, but that was Nixon's thing, and a large tax increase, which one also thought was necessary to pay for neglected programs. Agnew, after being nominated, told reporters that he had not changed and that he never felt more liberal in my life. It's a long piece. I'll send it to you. And this lie that they keep pushing on us, people like Howard Dean can go in front of a healthcare debate, and not only does he bring up the Southern strategy, he gets it wrong by claiming the Southern strategy was against Vietnam protesters. It's supposed to be about race. Can't you get your own why straight? That's all I have to ask him. And I thank you for your time, and I will email the entire piece to you. You guys run a great... I have to sit here with notes when I listen to your show. It's one of those shows where I have to constantly rewind it, constantly take notes, and I'm constantly learning, and I absolutely love your program.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks a lot. You can always listen to the podcast.
I do. Usually I don't... My girlfriend's yelling at me, we got to go do laundry. I usually do that. I said, no, I'm on the air with John and Frank. You have no idea who these people are. They're affiliated with Bob Grant, and she gave me this look like I have a piece of rusty glass in my face.
Well, tell her to join the fray here.
I do,
call.
and I will.
And call back again. Thank
you very much.
We appreciate it.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Are you going to seek appointment to the death panel, and is killing my grandma mandatory, or will there be an appeal process? I'm actually going to give a serious answer to that. You have to understand what's happening in this country. The truth is these meetings are not about health care. They're not. The people that you see, now I'm not talking about people who ask questions and people disagree. I've been doing book signings, and I've got plenty of conservatives that come to the book signings, and they ask really smart questions, and they're great. Because we should ask smart questions. No system is perfect. But the people who are shouting down their Congress people are very angry. And they're angry for three reasons. One is the Republicans have been running on anger for 30 years. It started with 40 years. It started with the Southern strategy in 1968. Anger against the people who are protesting the Vietnam War and so forth. Started with this 40 years. It started with a Southern strategy in 1968, anger against, against the people who were protesting the Vietnam War and so forth. Started with this 40 years. It started with a Southern strategy in 1968, anger against, against the people who were protesting the Vietnam War and so forth.
Let's talk about Nixon and the Southern Strategy. Richard M. Nixon, Politician, President, Administrator. Book by Leon Friedman and William F. Leventrosser. Greenwood Press. Written in 1991, 424 pages. Part 16. Richard Nixon, The Southern Strategy in the 1968 Presidential Election, by Glenn Moore. Some critics of Richard M. Nixon have vigorously attacked his 1968 presidential campaign in the South. The 1968 Democrat Party nominee, Hubert H. Humphrey, said that unlike Nixon, he went to the South and refused to play the cheap politics of saying it would slow down desegregation. Two Atlanta Constitution writers, Reg Murphy and Hall Gulliver, in The Southern Strategy, say Nixon's dealings with the South in the 1968 election were based on a calculated appeal to white segregationist sentiment. In fact, the term itself, Southern Strategy, as Nixon's former senior speechwriter William Safire writes, implies deviousness and discrimination. However, Nixon's 1968 campaign in the South is too complex a subject to be so simply dismissed as is done in such criticism. The paper will more carefully examine this topic as outlined here. First, in the campaign for the Republican nomination, Nixon's primary victories and his weak opposition gave him strong bargaining power with the South, and as a result, Nixon at times clearly veered from a Southern strategy. Third, the South had a limited role in the general election. Last, Nixon's meeting and agreements with Southern leaders and specific attacks by Hubert Humphrey and by Gulliver and Murphy on desegregation will be analyzed. Nixon says that he had met with most Southern leaders by the fall of 1967. After the great defeat of the 1964 GOP presidential candidates Barry Goldwater, Nixon believed that many Goldwater supporters now wanted a candidate who could win, and these conservatives would back him if he won the primaries. Nixon won with huge majorities in almost all of the Republican primaries he entered, often outdrawing winners of the Democrat primary. The New York's Governor Nelson A. Rockefeller write-in candidacy, with the exception of Massachusetts, drew poorly. In the New Hampshire primary, Nixon won over 84,000 votes, 79% of the vote, while Rockefeller received only 11,691 votes, or 11% of the vote. Although not then a candidate, Rockefeller said he would accept the draft. The governor of Michigan at the time, George Romney, trailed Nixon so far in the polls in the New Hampshire primary that he withdrew his candidacy about 2 weeks before the election. Texas State Republican Chairman Peter O'Donnell presided over the Atlanta session. Senator J. Strom Thurmond of South Carolina was one of the most important participants, and he flew into Atlanta for the second and last day's session on Saturday. Strom Thurmond, prior Democrat, had recently changed over to the Republican Party. After attending the meeting, South Carolina senator said, "I've been highly pleased with the statements that the former vice president made today. I think he's a great man, a great American, and I think he would be a great president." Nixon said the main issues they discussed were national defense, protections against textile imports, textile industry is very important in South Carolina, and civil rights. Nixon points out that Thurmond knew that he supported the 1964 Civil Rights Act and he would not compromise his position. Nixon only promised on desegregation not to make the South a whipping boy. Nixon strongly supported civil rights. When he had campaigned for president in 1960, he issued a statement with Nelson Rockefeller that included a strong civil rights stand. Their statement said, "Our program for civil rights must assure aggressive action to remove the remaining vestiges of segregation or discrimination in all areas of national life, voting and housing, schools and jobs. It will express support for the objectives of the sit-in demonstrations and will commend the action of those businessmen who have abandoned the practice of refusing to serve food at their lunch counters to their Negro customers and will urge all others to follow their example." A 1968 biography of Nixon said that it was revealed in the 1960 presidential campaign that Nixon had been a member of the and contributor to the National Association of American Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, for 10 years. Why? Wallace for President Chairman Frank Best expressed a view held by some Southerners in saying that Nixon was up to his ears in civil rights movements. Later, on June 22nd, Strom Thurmond endorsed Nixon and announced that all of South Carolina's 22 delegate votes would be cast for him. He gave his reasons for supporting Nixon and listed the issues he was concerned about in the presidential race, which included domestic lawlessness, Vietnam, the rising cost of living, a too powerful Supreme Court, and the need for the United States to maintain its military strength. Thurmond said that he did not agree with Nixon in every single issue, but added he is the most acceptable and electable candidate. Nixon's belief in a non-activist Supreme Court was probably a major reason Thurmond endorsed him. Just as the day before his announcement for Nixon, Thurmond had said that he was delighted Chief Justice Earl Warren was retiring and that Warren had done more harm to the American way of life than any other man holding public office in the history of our country. Many Southern Republicans' first choice would have been Ronald Reagan, or even George C. Wallace, the former Alabama governor and American Independent Party candidate. Thurman said he had no harsh words for Wallace. However, Reagan and Wallace stood little chance of being elected president, and so many conservatives turned to the more electable candidate, Nixon. Thurman's endorsement helped Nixon, and one South Carolina newspaper predicted that Nixon would win on the first ballot, with almost total support from the South. A more conservative estimate, United Press International, said Nixon had over 600 delegates and was close to winning the nomination. Nixon himself was certain enough of victory that he said he was no longer campaigning for delegates on a full-time basis. The biggest fallacy in the Southern strategy viewpoint is that it ignores the fact that Nixon had to win in other regions in order to get 270 electoral votes, necessary for winning the presidency. If Nixon emphasized winning Southern votes, then he risked losing support in the major industrial states, which would be committing political suicide. In fact, his emphasis had to be with the industrial states. Some papers, even very early in June, said that Nixon was looking beyond the Republican convention to November. Nixon needed to consider the general election early because he could not afford a pre-convention strategy that would destroy him in November. Nixon said there were going to be 7 key states in the 1968 presidential campaign: New York, California, Illinois, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Michigan. Of these, he had won only California and Ohio in 1960. This time had to win at least 3 in order to have a chance of winning the election. These key states listed by Nixon had 210 out of 270 electoral votes needed to be elected president. The South was not central to Nixon's campaign, as William Safire noted when he quoted from an article by Don Irwin of the Los Angeles Times. Richard M. Nixon's avowed determination to concentrate on voters in large industrial states if he wins the Republican presidential nomination tells much about the election campaign he has in mind. It appears the bar revival of the all-out Southern strategy that proved so disastrous for the GDP in 1964. 2 statements by Nixon before the convention showed him deviating from a Southern strategy. In New York, Nixon told newsmen that he did not want the support of George Wallace, and it appeared Wallace's appeal was in the direction of the racist element. A few days later, an article said that Nixon would select a moderate to liberal running mate, and that Reagan and Texas Senator John G. Tower were not being seriously considered. The article said that one of the 2 would be selected only if Nixon pursued a Southern strategy, which he said he would not do. The story stressed that Nixon was hoping to win some votes in the cities and among blacks. Reagan and Tower would hurt the ticket with these groups. While far ahead of his opponent, Nixon still did not have the nomination absolutely nailed down. On the day before the convention opened, one comprehensive survey showed that Nixon was about 50 votes short of the 667 needed to win. As the convention opened, Nixon had to hold on to Southern delegates, who leaned heavily toward him, but who would switch to Reagan. Reagan could have taken enough delegates in the South to deny Nixon a majority. However, he and Rockefeller did not coordinate their effort, which limited their effectiveness. Also, Reagan did not announce and officially begin his campaign until August 5th, which was a political editor, and John Tower said, too little, too late. When Reagan began actively campaigning, he appeared to be gaining support among Southern delegates. He was helped by articles published at this time that said Nixon was considering selecting a liberal running mate, such as John Lindsay or Illinois Senator Charles Percy. Regardless of whether the Nixon spokesman mentioned in the article correctly represented the candidate's position, Southern delegates read or heard about the articles, and this produced a rebellion of sorts in at least several Southern states. The Florida delegation was especially worried about Nixon selecting Percy, Lindsay, or Edward Brooke, senator from Massachusetts. In order to check a Reagan surge with Dixie delegates, Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater canceled a fishing trip to meet with them, and Thurman talked with some of the delegation. Clark Reed and Fred Lauer had earlier said that they would be able to hold their Mississippi delegates for Nixon, but Reed now said the delegation was loose and could go either way. Goldwater and Thurman's visits helped placate some wavering delegates from the South, but probably even more important was a meeting between Nixon and Southern delegates at the Hilton Plaza, where the candidates were staying. The Miami Herald persuaded one of the Florida delegates to conceal a tape recorder and tape Nixon's brief speech and discussion with the delegates. The following quotes from Nixon are taken from the transcript of the meeting. Nixon met with 2 groups of delegates from the South on Tuesday morning, August 6th. Delegates from Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Arkansas, Florida, and the District of Columbia were in the session that was taped. Nixon squarely addressed the stories that said he was going to pick a liberal running mate, saying, "There have been some cockeyed stories that Nixon has made a deal with this one or that one." He then discussed his qualifications for vice president candidate, included with, "I'm not going to take, I can assure you, anybody that is going to divide this party." In his talk, Nixon stressed points that would appeal to conservatives, but was cautious enough not to make any kind of blatant regional, much less racist appeals. On busing, he said, "My feeling is this. I think that busing a child that is 2 or 3 grades behind another child into a strange community, I think you destroy that child. We have got to educate them, and I don't believe in that manner of approach. On the Supreme Court and judges, Nixon denounced judges for running school boards and said, I think it is the job of the courts to interpret the law and not make the law. Hear, hear. If there was an embarrassment for Nixon, it was probably in the area of open housing. Nixon's role in the passage of an open housing bill in April 1968 was mentioned earlier in this paper. A delegate asked Nixon about his stance on the issue, and he explained, so I had a hard decision to make, and I talked to Gary Ford about it, vote for it, and get it out of the way. In my view, I think it's virtually important to get the civil rights and open housing issues out of our sight so we didn't have a split party over the platform when we came down here to Miami Beach. This he concluded on the subject by saying, I would have preferred that it be handled at the state and local level. As one source recognized, Nixon made it appear that he opposed open housing in principle, but not, in this case, on practicalities. Even so, he had been daft enough to not say this directly. Reactions to his speech differed. For example, there was some criticism from Florida delegates who did not think Nixon was conservative enough. But these delegates were in the minority. For those who claim Nixon appeased the Southerners, this belief is countered by his refusal to give any specific names of whom he was considering for a running mate. Also, as one newspaper noted about Nixon meeting with delegates from the South, most of what he said was consistent with what Mr. Nixon had been saying publicly. By Wednesday, August 6th, the Reagan drive had faltered. Nixon and his workers had well checked the drive by Reagan, who won 182 delegates at the convention, which was 10 votes less than a New York Times survey 2 days before the convention opened. Nixon won the nomination with 692 delegates on the first ballot. The foundation for Nixon's winning the South had been laid long before. Nixon won the support of key gold voter Republicans such as Peter O'Donnell of Texas, James Martin of Alabama, Clark Reed of Mississippi, and Strom Thurmond of South Carolina. By getting financial and organizational help early, Nixon made it difficult for the less organized Reagan to be able to overtake him. Nixon, according to one story, stood up backing from these key leaders in the Atlanta meeting by promising that he would not have a philosophically split ticket. Nixon's choice of Spiro T. Agnew as his running mate aroused some liberal opposition at the convention, and his selection was seen by some as a concession to the South. However, Agnew actually did not have solid conservative credentials. In March 1968, Agnew was recognized as being a longtime Rockefeller supporter and was a leader of a draft Rockefeller committee. When Rockefeller announced he was not running during March 21st, he did not tell Agnew in advance. Rockefeller's failure to tell Agnew he was not going to run caused his supporter embarrassment with newsmen. Agnew had invited newsmen into the governor's mansion to watch Rockefeller's speech on television. Much to Agnew's surprise, the New York governor announced he was not a candidate. When Rockefeller reversed himself on April 30th and declared his candidacy, Agnew was then neutral. Agnew had strong black support when he ran for governor in 1966. He ran against George P. Mahoney, a Democrat who strongly opposed open housing. In 1960, a Democrat who strongly opposed open housing. In 1963, when Agnew was elected executive of Baltimore County, he passed the first local public accommodations law in the South. As governor, he passed an open housing bill, hired many blacks, passed fair hiring bills, and helped enact other progressive legislation, including a tough anti-pollution bill and a large tax increase, which one author thought was necessary to pay for neglected programs. Agnew, after being nominated, told reporters that he had not changed and that he'd never felt more liberal in my life. After rioting took place in Maryland when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, Agnew began taking a strong stand against rioting and seemed less sympathetic and more critical of black leaders. But even after this change, liberal black columnist Carl Rowan said Agnew is a moderate and clearly no racist. Agnew was not so arch-conservative. He was not one of Strom Thurmond's own choices. Thurmond had preferred Tower or Reagan. Thurmond's response to Agnew was mixed, telling Southerners he had talked and that he believed Agnew would not add to the ticket, but is not especially objectionable. From all I hear about him, he is a fine man who is strong for law and order. The ideology of Agnew and the South's influence on Nixon were distorted to some extent. The Republican candidate for the U.S. Senate in South Carolina stated the inaccurate but widely held view that Agnew's nomination was a victory for the South, and Senator Strom Thurmond played key roles in shaping that ticket. Agnew's little stands in the past were mostly forgotten and probably did little more than help to limit Republican left rebelliousness against him. Nixon himself was partially responsible for the distorted view of Agnew, as he was not emphasizing Agnew's liberal acts as governor. The thrust of Nixon's general election campaign had been described earlier. More specifically regarding the South, Nixon said the Deep South had to be virtually conceded to George Wallace. I could not match him there without compromising on civil rights issues, which I would not do. As one of Nixon's leading political strategists wrote, Nixon would focus his Southern campaign in the outer South, including Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. Nixon's campaign in the South ignored Wallace for the most part, saying only that a vote for the third-party candidate was wasted since he could not win. In Atlanta, Nixon directly attacked Wallace, saying he was not fit to be president because of his statement that he would have his driver run over any protesters who blocked his way. But such attacks were rare. Nixon did not soften his stand on civil rights. He did strongly support law and order, but so did many other candidates in 1968. The more liberal Humphrey, for example, during one campaign stop told a group of blacks about the need for law and order. The Southern strategy was more complex than has been recognized. In fact, there was no Southern strategy, but rather an outer South strategy. Victories in the primaries, combined with Rockefeller's and Reagan's belated and uncoordinated campaigns, never put Nixon in a position in which he had to desperately bid for Southern delegates. During the meeting with the Republican state chairman in Atlanta and with the delegates in Miami, Nixon made no unreasonable commitments. While he emphasized issues likely to be popular with Southerners, even the transcript of his private meeting with Southern delegates is consistent with his public statements of the time, meaning he gave them nothing. One key test of Nixon's strategy is on the issue of desegregation. The Southern strategy claims that Nixon told Strom Thurmond he would slow down desegregation if elected president. Exactly the opposite happened, as Nixon described in his memoirs. Schools in the South and all across the country opened in the fall of 1970 without violence and in compliance with the Supreme Court's order. The dramatic success of our Southern desegregation program is eloquently told by the statistics. By 1974, only 8% of black children in the South were attending all-black schools, down from 68% in the fall of 1968. Daniel Patrick Moynihan recognized the success of desegregation under Nixon. As he said in 1970, there has been more change in the structure of American public school education in the past month than in the past 100 years. There was nothing inherently wrong with Nixon's bringing Southerners into the electoral process. In fact, it probably made desegregation easier. And in 1970, there was no violence, as when John F. Kennedy was president, for example, and over 375 people were injured, and 2 persons were killed at the University of Mississippi when it integrated. Nixon's desegregation followed his general policy of dealing with the South, which one of his main domestic advisors, John Ehrlichman, Ehrlichman, I never know how to pronounce his name, said was done. His way with consultation and understanding, and not in a fashion that would evade the political sensibilities of Southerners and conservatives. The true test of the Southern strategy was shown when Nixon carried the region with 70.5% of the vote. Nixon's campaign in the 1968 presidential election in the South has not deserved its scathing attacks. Its great success was well shown by the fact that the South underwent its most massive school integration in history peacefully, while President Nixon's popularity in the region increased. These positive fruits were largely the results of Nixon's 1968 presidential campaign and his Southern strategy. Nixon on civil rights. The Nixon years witnessed the first large-scale integration of public schools in the South. Strategically, Nixon sought a middle between the segregationist George C. Wallace and liberal Democrats whose support of integration was alienating some Southern white Democrats. His plan had since become known as the Southern strategy. I spoke of that. He was determined to implement exactly what the courts had ordered, desegregation, but did not favor busing children, in the words of Arthur Conrad Black, all over the country to satisfy capricious meddling of judges. Nixon, the Quaker, felt that racism was the greatest moral failure of the United States, concentrated on the principle that the law must be colorblind.